My mom chose her cheating husband over me, so I spent years gathering evidence, exposed him for fraud, and forced her to rebuild from ashes while I rose higher than she ever dreamed. I was 14 when my mom finally got remarried to a man called Mike. I didn't know much about him, but one thing was for sure. He was rich, expensive watch, BMW car, very put together. When we moved in together, he didn't talk to me much, but I didn't care, because he was winning me over with new clothes and technology. So to me, he was a keeper, and to my mom too. She practically had a designer bag for every day of the month, and I'd constantly see her flaunting her new, very expensive jewelry on Instagram. I was happy for her, especially after her last husband, my bio dad. I never met him, but my mom always talked about him, and it was never anything good. Apparently, one time he got mad at her for saying the F word, so he hit her so hard that red started pouring out of her mouth. Or another time, he tripped her up when she was pregnant with me, and I almost unalived, all because she forgot to unload the dishwasher. So this was obviously a huge improvement, or so I thought. One day, I heard my stepdad come home at 3 a.m. This would have been normal, except I could hear giggling from a woman too. And my mom was on a work trip. I could hear animalistic sounds from the bottom floor for almost an hour before it was replaced by my stepdad's snoring. That's when I got to work. I sneaked downstairs and snapped a quick photo of the woman lying on top of my stepdad, completely unclothed. I didn't send it to my mom yet, because I wanted to wait until she got home first. I really thought I was doing the right thing. Apparently not. She arrived 2 days later, while my stepdad wasn't home. I waited until she had settled to show her the photos. "What the F is wrong with you?" Her face flushed red with anger. "You're always twisting things. People always leave because of you." I stared at her in disbelief. I swear I thought she was pranking me, but that's when she started a full 5-minute monologue about how I was not only the worst son to ever exist, but also that I was responsible for constantly ruining our family. She grabbed the phone, deleted the photos, and handed me a trash bag. "You're not ruining this for me. Put your belongings into this bag. I'm kicking you out." By this point, tears were streaming down my face. Thoughts so deeply rooted in self-hatred polluted my mind. I truly believed that I was the reason for my mom's suffering, that I had essentially ruined her life simply by being born. And these were the narratives that made me pack my stuff up so quickly, eager to let my mom be free of me. When I was done, I got in the car and asked where she was driving me. "A relative. Don't worry about it," was all she replied with. The rest of the 3-hour drive was done in silence. When we got to the house, she didn't even pull into the driveway, just told me to get out, so I did. By the time I made it to the mysterious front door, I didn't even have the heart to knock. I felt so awkward. Luckily, after 5 minutes, the person opened it by themselves. It was a man with brown hair and brown eyes, the same as me. His eyes widened, and he immediately lunged at me for a hug. "I knew you'd come back eventually," he said, with tears in his eyes. I looked at him with my eyebrows furrowed, unable to hide my confusion. But when he invited me inside, everything became clear. He was my biological father. My stomach twisted when he revealed this, and everything in me was screaming at me to get up and run. But something about the warmth in his eyes told me there was more to the story, so I stayed, and I was right. Because everything my mom had told me about him was BS. She just said it out of fear that I would go looking for him one day. Well, I myself opened up about her new marriage, and how I had exposed him for cheating. My dad looked so disgusted I thought he was actually going to vomit. He told me my mom was a narcissist, meaning almost any time I felt guilty for something, it was most likely just manipulation. I thought back to all the things she had blamed me for in the past. Her painful periods, her loss of youth, her cigarette addiction, even her bills. That was one of my most vulnerable moments. And as my dad held me, I realized it was the first time I'd ever felt comforted. Anger ran through my veins. The type of anger that's laced with grief. Grief for the childhood I never got. Grief for the fact I was forced to mature faster than my peers. And none of it was my fault. It was my mom's. I didn't know it at the time, but while I was fantasizing about simply cutting her off, my dad was fantasizing about changing my life forever. But I was the first to take action. I started small, helping more around the house, learning to cook so dad didn't have to make dinner after long workdays. I got a part-time job at a local computer repair shop to earn my own spending money. Dad was proud of my maturity, but he had no idea what was really driving me. Meanwhile, I kept building my Mike file. I created a detailed spreadsheet of his movements based on social media check-ins. I noted patterns, certain hotels he frequented, restaurants where he'd meet different women. I even figured out which days mom was most likely to be away or busy with her own activities, which seemed to coincide with Mike's boys' nights. When I turned 17, I got my first real break. My friend's brother Robert got a job at a different hotel, one of those ultra-luxury places downtown. He texted me one night saying Mike was there with some guys who looked like they stepped out of a Scorsese movie. I asked Robert to keep an eye out and let me know if he saw anything interesting. A week later, Robert called me. He'd overheard Mike and his associates discussing some kind of investment opportunity that sounded sketchy as hell. Robert couldn't get details, but he heard enough to know it involved promising people huge returns on property investments. I started researching investment scams and Ponzi schemes. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that Mike was running some kind of fraud operation, but I needed proof, not just suspicions. I decided to take a bigger risk. I applied for a summer internship at the property management company that handled Mike's office building. I didn't tell anyone except Dad, who thought I was just being responsible and planning for college applications. I got the internship and spent 3 months filing paperwork, delivering mail, and most importantly, learning the layout of the building and the routines of its occupants. Mike's company occupied half of the 4th floor, The official name was Coastal Wealth Partners, which sounded legitimate enough. But I noticed some strange things. Very few actual clients ever visited. The same group of about 8 men came and went at odd hours. And once a month, Mike would arrive with a briefcase, go into his private office with his main associate, a guy named Victor with a permanent scowl, and lock the door for exactly 1 hour. I couldn't access Mike's office directly, but I made friends with the night cleaning staff. One of them, Maria, mentioned that Mike's office was the only one they weren't allowed to clean when the briefcase meetings happened. They had to wait until the next day. She also mentioned finding shredded documents sometimes, despite the company having a paperless office policy they bragged about. By the end of the summer, I had compiled enough suspicious activity to convince me that Mike was definitely up to something illegal, but I still didn't have actual proof. I needed documents, recordings, something concrete, and I needed to be patient. I was heading to college soon. I'd been accepted to State University with a partial scholarship. Dad was so proud, even though I knew he was worried about paying the remaining tuition. That's when Mom dropped another bombshell. She and Mike were getting married. She called me to share the happy news and said she hoped I would be part of the wedding. I congratulated her through gritted teeth and promised to check my schedule. Then I hung up and punched my pillow until my knuckles hurt. The wedding was scheduled for the summer after my freshman year of college. Mom kept sending me details about tuxedo fittings and rehearsal dinners. I responded with minimal enthusiasm. Dad never mentioned it, but I could tell he knew from the sad look in his eyes whenever I got off the phone with Mom. My first year of college was actually pretty great, despite everything. I majored in business with a focus on finance, partly because I was genuinely interested in it, and partly because I wanted to understand exactly what kind of scam Mike was running. I made good friends, joined the investment club, and even started dating a girl named Sarah from my economics class. I came home for winter break to find Dad dating someone steadily for the first time since the divorce. Her name was Carol, a kindergarten teacher he'd met at a community fundraiser. She was kind, funny, and treated Dad with actual respect. I liked her immediately. Seeing Dad happy gave me even more motivation to continue with my plan. I also used the break to drive by Mike's office building a few times. I noticed some changes. A new sign, expanded office space. Whatever he was doing, business was good. I did some research and found that Coastal Wealth Partners was now advertising exclusive investment opportunities in overseas developments with guaranteed returns of 15 to 20%. Classic Ponzi scheme language. When I returned to college for spring semester, I couldn't stop thinking about Mike's business. Those guaranteed returns were a massive red flag. I started spending my free time between classes researching investment fraud and securities regulations. My roommate probably thought I was crazy, hunched over my laptop at 2 a.m. reading SEC enforcement actions like they were thriller novels. I also created a separate email account and reached out to a few financial journalists anonymously, asking hypothetical questions about how they'd investigate potential investment scams. Most ignored me, but one reporter from a business news site sent back some useful tips about public record searches and financial disclosure requirements. Spring break rolled around, and instead of heading to Cancun with my friends, I went home with a mission. I told Dad I was working on a special research project, which wasn't exactly a lie. While he was at work, I dug through our home filing cabinets looking for any old documents related to Mom and Mike. I hit the jackpot when I found some paperwork Mom had accidentally left behind during the divorce, bank statements showing large cash withdrawals around the time she met Mike. I also happened to run into Mom for coffee, something I rarely initiated. I pretended to be more accepting of Mike, asking innocent questions about his business. Mom didn't know much, or pretended not to, but mentioned they were planning to buy a vacation home in the Caymans. Another red flag. Classic place to hide money. When I got back to campus, I threw myself into my studies but kept my investigation going on the side. I joined the university's business law club and made friends with a senior named Reese, who was headed to law school the next year. Without revealing my personal connection, I picked Reese's brain about financial crimes and the statute of limitations, just gathering information, building my knowledge base. Summer arrived faster than expected. I'd managed to line up an internship at a local financial services firm in my hometown, giving me a perfect excuse to be around while also padding my resume. The wedding was scheduled for late July, giving me almost 2 months of reconnaissance time. My first week back, I noticed Mike had a new car, some Italian sports thing that probably cost more than Dad's house. Mom was sporting new jewelry and talking about renovating their already ridiculous mansion again. Meanwhile, Dad was still picking up extra consulting gigs to cover my tuition gap, despite me telling him I could take out loans. The contrast made my blood boil, but I stayed focused. I started driving different routes to work, ones that happened to pass by Mike's office building. I noticed patterns, certain days when black SUVs with tinted windows would be parked in the reserved spots. I documented everything in an encrypted file on my laptop. About 3 weeks before the wedding, I got my first real break. I was at a coffee shop near Mike's office, pretending to study while actually watching the building entrance. An older man stormed out, red-faced and shouting into his phone about being completely screwed over and calling the authorities. I casually moved tables to get closer. The man was telling someone named Barbara that their retirement money was gone. He mentioned Mike by name, calling him a smooth-talking con artist. I waited until he hung up, then approached him, claiming I'd overheard and was worried because my parents had invested with Coastal Wealth Partners too. Total lie, but it worked. The man, who introduced himself as Gerald, was initially suspicious suspicious, but eventually opened up. He and his wife had invested their entire retirement fund, over $300,000, in one of Mike's guaranteed overseas development projects. When they tried to withdraw some money for a medical procedure, they were given the runaround for weeks before being told the funds were temporarily inaccessible due to international banking regulations. I asked Gerald if he had any documentation of his investments. He had a folder in his car with everything: contracts, prospectuses, emails. I convinced him to let me make copies at the nearby print shop, promising to show them to my family financial advisor to see if there was any recourse. I paid for the copies myself and thanked him profusely. That night, I stayed up until 3 a.m. reviewing the documents. They were full of impressive-looking charts and projections, but light on actual specifics. The fine print was especially concerning, clauses that essentially gave Mike's company complete discretion over when and how to return investor funds. I wasn't a lawyer, but even I could tell this was sketchy as hell. The next day, I called in sick to my internship and drove to the state capitol, where the Securities Regulation Division was located. I anonymously dropped off copies of Gerald's documents with a note suggesting they might want to look into Coastal Wealth Partners. I kept the originals in a secure location, not at Dad's house where Mom might potentially see them during a visit. 2 weeks before the wedding, I attended the bachelor party as the representative of Mike's soon-to-be stepson. I didn't want to go, but it was a perfect intelligence gathering opportunity. The event was exactly as tacky as I expected. A private room at an upscale steakhouse followed by a gentleman's club with bottle service. I nursed one drink all night, staying sober while Mike and his buddies got increasingly wasted. I recorded snippets of conversation on my phone, capturing Mike bragging about how they were absolutely killing it with the Cayman project and how some high-net-worth suckers were practically throwing money at them. His main business partner, Victor, was slightly more careful, occasionally telling Mike to shut up about business when he got too specific. But they were all pretty loose-lipped by midnight. I heard enough to confirm my suspicions. They were definitely running some kind of investment scam, promising returns they couldn't possibly deliver. The most disturbing part came when Mike pulled me aside, arm around my shoulder, breath reeking of expensive scotch. He told me how proud he was to be my stepdad, and how he could set me up for life after graduation if I came to work for him. He mentioned something about needing fresh blood because some of their investors were getting antsy. I smiled and thanked him while my stomach turned. 1 week before the wedding, I got a call from Sarah, my girlfriend from school. We'd been dating for about 6 months at this point. She was interning at a law firm for the summer and had access to legal databases. As a favor to me, I'd told her I was researching investment fraud for a special project. She'd run a background check on Mike. What she found was gold. Mike had been named in 2 civil suits in another state about 7 years ago, both settled out of court with sealed agreements. The plaintiffs were former investors in something called Atlantic Opportunity Fund, which had mysteriously dissolved after the settlements. Mike had changed his name slightly back then, Richard instead of Mike, different middle initial, but it was definitely him. I thanked Sarah profusely and promised to take her somewhere nice when we got back to campus. Then I added this new information to my growing file. I was building a solid case, but I still needed more. I needed current evidence of wrongdoing, not just past suspicions. 3 days before the wedding, I was helping Mom with some wedding errands, maintaining my cover as the supportive son, when Mike called her in a panic. I could hear him shouting through the phone about those idiots at the office and how he needed to move some things immediately. Mom told me she had to go and rushed off, leaving me with a car full of wedding favors to deliver to the venue. I took a calculated risk. Instead of going straight to the venue, I drove to Mike's office building. The parking garage was accessible without a key card during business hours. I parked and walked casually toward the elevator like I belonged there. When I reached the 4th floor, I saw chaos. People were rushing around, shredding documents, packing boxes. Through the glass doors of Coastal Wealth Partners, I could see Mike gesturing wildly, while Victor and 2 other men were disconnecting computers and loading files into boxes. I couldn't get closer without being noticed, but I didn't need to. This was clearly a panic response to something. I took a few discreet photos with my phone and left quickly. Back in my car, I checked local news sites and financial news, looking for what might have triggered this reaction. Nothing obvious appeared. The next morning, I found out. The State Securities Division had announced an informal inquiry into several investment firms specializing in overseas development projects. Coastal Wealth Partners wasn't named specifically, but the description matched their business model perfectly. My anonymous tip had apparently hit home. I called Gerald, the investor I'd met, and asked if he'd heard anything. He told me he'd received a strange call from Victor the previous day, offering to return his investment in full if he would sign a non-disclosure agreement. Gerald was suspicious, but desperate for his money back, so he'd agreed to meet them later that day. I suggested he might want to consult with a lawyer before signing anything, and recommended he record the conversation if legal in our state. It was. Gerald thanked me for the advice, still not realizing I had any personal connection to the situation. The day before the wedding, all hell broke loose. I was at the rehearsal dinner, making awkward small talk with Mike's side of the family, when Mike got a phone call. He stepped outside, but I could see him through the window, pacing and gesturing angrily. When he came back in, his face was ashen. Mom asked what was wrong, and he muttered something about business complications that needed his immediate attention. He apologized to everyone and said he had to leave for a few hours, but would be back. Mom looked confused, but played it off to the guests as a minor emergency. I excused myself shortly after, claiming I needed to pick up my formal shoes which were being polished for the wedding. A lie. Instead, I drove to Mike's office building again. The parking lot was filled with cars despite it being after 8 p.m. As I watched from across the street, I saw people leaving with boxes and computer equipment. Classic signs of a business dissolving in a hurry. I followed a hunch and drove to Mike and Mom's mansion. Mike's sports car was in the driveway, along with several other expensive vehicles I recognized from his office parking lot. I parked down the street and watched. Through the large front windows, I could see people moving around inside, carrying things. I took a chance and walked closer, staying in the shadows of the large hedges that bordered their property. Through a side window, I could see into Mike's home office. He was stuffing documents into a shredder, while Victor and another man were filling suitcases with what looked like cash and passport-sized documents. I took video with my phone, my hands shaking with adrenaline. This was it, actual evidence of what appeared to be them preparing to flee. I backed away carefully and returned to my car. I had a decision to make. Should I call the police, the securities regulators, or should I confront Mom first? I decided to call Dad. He deserved to know what was happening before everything exploded. I drove to his house and showed him the video and all the evidence I'd gathered over the past 2 years. He was stunned, both by Mike's apparent crimes and by my elaborate investigation. After a long silence, Dad asked what I wanted to do. I told him I thought we should tell Mom immediately. Whatever Mike had done, she might be implicated if she was married to him when everything came crashing down. Dad agreed, though I could tell he was conflicted about helping Mom after everything she'd done. We drove to the mansion together. The extra cars were gone now, but Mike's was still there. Dad rang the doorbell while I hung back, not wanting to immediately reveal that I was the one who'd uncovered everything. Mom answered, looking stressed. She started to ask why we were there, but Dad cut her off, telling her we needed to speak with her immediately about something serious. She let us in reluctantly, saying Mike was busy with work emergencies and the wedding was falling apart. Dad gently but firmly told her we had reason to believe Mike was involved in financial crimes and might be planning to flee the country. Mom's first reaction was anger. How dare we try to ruin her wedding with ridiculous accusations? That's when I stepped forward and showed her the video I'd taken just hours earlier. Her face went through a series of emotions: disbelief, shock, anger, and finally, fear. She admitted she'd noticed some strange behavior recently. Secretive phone calls, unexplained cash, Mike's insistence that they get their passports renewed last month. But she'd convinced herself it was normal rich person stuff, things she wasn't used to from her middle-class life with Dad. While we were talking, we heard a noise from upstairs. Mike was coming down. Mom panicked, whispering for us to leave, saying she'd handle it. Dad refused, saying we weren't going anywhere until she was safe. Mike appeared at the top of the stairs, saw us, and froze. He was carrying a small suitcase and wearing travel clothes, not exactly the look of a man preparing for his wedding the next day. When he saw my phone in my hand, pointed in his direction, something in his expression changed. He knew he was caught. What followed was surreal. Mike tried to play it cool, claiming he was just organizing some business documents that had gotten mixed up. When that didn't work, he switched to anger, demanding we leave his house. When that didn't work either, he tried bribery, offering Dad a substantial investment opportunity if he'd just forget what he'd seen. Through it all, Mom stood there in shock, watching her carefully constructed new life crumble around her. Finally, she found her voice and asked Mike directly, "Are you running some kind of scam? Are we in trouble?" Mike's response was telling. Instead of denying it outright, he told her not to worry, that he had everything under control, and these things happen in business sometimes. He said they just needed to take a little vacation until things cool down. That's when Mom lost it. She started yelling about the wedding, her reputation, all the guests who were already in town. Mike snapped back that none of that mattered now, that they needed to leave tonight. He let slip that the securities division had contacted their lawyer and a formal investigation was being launched tomorrow. I was recording the whole conversation on my phone. Mike noticed and lunged for it, but Dad stepped between us. Mike shoved him, Dad shoved back, and for a moment, I thought they might actually fight. But Mike backed down, always the coward when confronted directly. Mom was crying now, asking how this could be happening. Mike told her to pull herself together and pack a bag. They were leaving in an hour. He said something about a private plane waiting at the regional airport. That's when I decided we had enough evidence. I stepped away and called 911, reporting that I was witnessing what appeared to be flight to avoid prosecution. While on the phone, I also called the State Securities Division emergency hotline number I'd saved weeks ago and left a detailed message. Mike realized what I was doing and made a break for it, grabbing his suitcase and car keys. Dad tried to block him, but Mike shoved past and ran for the garage. We heard his sports car start up and the squeal of tires as he peeled out of the driveway. Mom collapsed onto the stairs, sobbing. Between tears, she revealed that she'd signed a lot of paperwork for Mike over the past year, investment documents, bank authorizations, even power of attorney for some of their joint assets. She had no idea what any of it really meant. She'd just signed where he told her to. The police arrived about 15 minutes later, followed by 2 men in suits who identified themselves as from the securities division. They'd been monitoring Mike already and had agents at the airport. Mike was apprehended apprehended trying to board a private jet, registered to a shell company in the Caymans. The next 48 hours were chaos. The wedding was obviously cancelled, leaving Mom to deal with confused and angry guests. The mansion was searched by investigators who found evidence of wire fraud, investment fraud, and money laundering. Mom was questioned repeatedly, but ultimately treated as another victim rather than an accomplice, largely because she could prove she had no real involvement in the business. I provided all my evidence to the authorities, including my recordings, documents, and the information from Gerald and other investors I'd connected with. The investigators were impressed with my thoroughness, though they gently suggested that vigilante fraud investigation wasn't the safest hobby. Mike was denied bail due to flight risk. Victor and 2 other associates were also arrested. The preliminary estimate was that they'd defrauded investors of over $15 million through their various schemes. The wedding venue became an impromptu command center for victims to file reports and claims. Mom stayed with a friend for a few days, too embarrassed to face Dad or me. When she finally called, she was a different person, humbled, shaken, and suddenly aware of how much she'd thrown away for a mirage. She asked if she could come over to Dad's house to talk. Dad, being Dad, said yes. That conversation was one of the most uncomfortable experiences of my life. Mom tried to explain how she'd been seduced by Mike's lifestyle and promises, how she'd convinced herself she deserved more than the boring life she'd had with Dad. She admitted to having the affair for months before Dad discovered it, something I hadn't known. Dad listened quietly, occasionally nodding. When she finished, he didn't yell or gloat about her spectacular fall. He simply said he was sorry she was going through this difficult time, but that he had moved on with his life and was happy with Carol. The finality in his voice seemed to hit Mom harder than any angry words could have. As for me, I told Mom I needed time. I wasn't ready to forgive her for choosing Mike over us, for disrupting my teenage years, for making Dad cry when she thought no one was looking. She accepted this with a sad nod, saying she understood and would be there when I was ready to talk more. The aftermath continued through my sophomore year of college. I was called to give depositions and statements multiple times. Mike's trial was scheduled, postponed, rescheduled. More victims came forward. The total fraud amount climbed to nearly $20 million. Mom had to sell most of her jewelry and designer clothes to pay for a lawyer. The mansion was seized as an asset in the fraud case. She moved into a small apartment and, in a twist of irony, went back to work full-time at the real estate office where she'd worked part-time during her marriage to Dad. Dad and Carol got engaged that Christmas. I was genuinely happy for them. Carol never tried to be my mom, just a supportive friend who made Dad smile again. They bought a small cabin by a lake for weekend getaways, nothing fancy, but exactly what made them happy. As for me, I changed my major to forensic accounting with a minor in criminal justice. My experience had shown me I had a knack for following money trails and spotting inconsistencies. Sarah was supportive, though she occasionally teased me about my obsessive tendencies. We were still going strong, talking about getting an apartment together for junior year. Mike's trial finally began the summer after my sophomore year. I attended when I could, sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom. The evidence against him was overwhelming. In addition to my documentation, the prosecution had bank records showing millions transferred to offshore accounts, testimony from dozens of victims, and damning emails recovered from the company servers. The most surprising testimony came from Victor, who took a plea deal in exchange for revealing everything. He testified that Mike had run similar schemes twice before in different states, changing his name slightly each time and moving on when things got too hot. This wasn't his first rodeo, just his biggest and most ambitious scam. Victor also revealed something that made my blood run cold. Apparently, Mike had initially targeted Mom specifically because background research showed Dad had a substantial 401k and home equity. Mike had hoped to get his hands on Dad's money through Mom. When that didn't work out as planned, thanks to Dad's lawyer insisting on a clean break in the divorce, Mike had to settle for just the divorce settlement. This revelation hit Mom hard. She hadn't just been a fool for love, she'd been a mark, targeted and manipulated by a professional con man. In a way, it gave her some dignity back. She hadn't thrown away her marriage for nothing. She'd been deliberately victimized by someone who made a living destroying lives. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Mike was found guilty on 27 counts of fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion. He was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution to his victims, money that would likely never be fully recovered since much of it had been spent on his lavish lifestyle or hidden in accounts the authorities couldn't reach. After the sentencing, Mom approached me outside the courthouse. She looked older, more worn down, but somehow more real than she had in years. She asked if we could talk sometime, not to reconcile or pretend nothing had happened, but just to try to understand each other better. I agreed to think about it. That night, I had dinner with Dad and Carol. We didn't celebrate Mike's sentencing. Dad wasn't the type to rejoice in anyone's downfall, even someone who deserved it. Instead, we talked about the future, Dad and Carol's upcoming wedding, my internship at a forensic accounting firm, the possibility of me going to graduate school after college. As I drove back to my summer apartment, I reflected on the past 2 years. My revenge plan had succeeded beyond my wildest expectations. Mike was in prison. His fraud was exposed. Mom had lost her ill-gotten lifestyle. Dad was happy with someone who truly appreciated him, but I didn't feel the satisfaction I'd expected. Instead, I felt a strange emptiness, like I'd spent so long focused on bringing Mike down that I hadn't fully planned for what came after. I'd achieved my goal, but But now what? I decided to meet with Mom the following week, not to forgive and forget, but to start figuring out what our relationship might look like going forward. She was still my mother, despite everything, and maybe understanding how she'd been manipulated would help me make sense of the choices she'd made. When I got home, I opened my laptop and looked at the Mike file one last time. Hundreds of documents, photos, recordings, and notes representing countless hours of investigation. I selected all the files and moved them to a folder labeled Closed Cases. Then I opened a new document and started typing notes for a paper I was considering writing for my forensic accounting class. Digital breadcrumbs, how modern Ponzi schemes leave evidence trails. The revenge chapter of my life was over. Whatever came next would be about building something new rather than tearing something down. I was ready to focus on my future, a future that, thanks to everything I'd learned during my investigation, was looking brighter than I could have imagined when this all began. I met with Mom at a coffee shop near her apartment the following week. She looked different, no designer clothes or fancy jewelry, just jeans and a simple blouse. Her hair wasn't professionally styled anymore. She looked more like the Mom I remembered from before Mike came along. We sat in awkward silence for a few minutes before she finally spoke. She apologized again, not just for Mike, but for how she'd treated Dad and me during the divorce. Then she dropped a bombshell. She admitted she'd been planning to leave Dad even before meeting Mike. Apparently she'd felt trapped in her suburban life and wanted more excitement. Mike just happened to come along at the right time with his flashy lifestyle and big promises. I didn't know what to say to that. Part of me wanted to walk out right there, but I stayed and listened as she continued unloading years of secrets. She confessed to hiding money from Dad during their marriage, spending it on weekend trips with friends that she'd lied about. She admitted to deliberately sabotaging Dad's attempts to reconcile during their separation by telling him I didn't want to see him, when actually I'd been asking for him constantly. Each revelation made me angrier, but I kept my cool. I wanted to hear it all. The worst part came when she admitted she'd thrown away some of Dad's important work documents during the divorce to make him miss a deadline for a promotion. She said she was jealous of his success while she felt stuck in her part-time job. I had to grip the edge of the table to stay seated after hearing that. When she finally ran out of confessions, I just stared at her. This woman wasn't just a victim of Mike's manipulation. She'd been selfish and vindictive long before he came along. I told her I needed time to process everything and left without finishing my coffee. I drove straight to Dad's house. He was in the backyard with Carol, working on their vegetable garden. I waited until Carol went inside to get drinks before telling him what Mom had revealed. I expected him to be furious about the sabotaged promotion, but he just nodded sadly, like he'd suspected it all along. I always wondered about those missing files, he said, pulling off his gardening gloves. That project could have fast-tracked me to senior management. But you know what? If I'd gotten that promotion, I would have been traveling more, working longer hours. I might have missed a lot of your high school years. That was so typically Dad, finding the silver lining even in Mom's deliberate sabotage. I asked if he was angry knowing the truth now. He thought about it for a minute before answering. I was angry for a long time, son, but being angry at my mom just made me miserable. It didn't hurt her at all. At some point, you have to decide if carrying that anger is worth the wait. I wasn't ready to be that forgiving, but I respected Dad's perspective. We changed the subject and helped Carol harvest some tomatoes for dinner. I stayed overnight in my old room, thinking about everything that had happened and what should come next. The following week, I returned to my internship at the forensic accounting firm. My boss had been following Mike's case in the news and was impressed with my connection to it. When I mentioned some of the investigative techniques I'd used, he suggested I might want to consider a career with the FBI or SEC after graduation. The idea was appealing, using my skills to catch other scammers before they could destroy more lives. Meanwhile, the court-appointed receivers were still tracking down Mike's assets. They found accounts in Belize, Singapore, and the Cayman Islands, but most had been emptied before they could be frozen. They also discovered Mike had a girlfriend in Tampa, some 25-year-old yoga instructor he'd been setting up in an expensive condo. She claimed she had no idea where any money might be hidden, but they found $50,000 cash in her closet that she couldn't explain. Mom called every few days, trying to rebuild some kind of relationship. I kept our conversations brief and superficial. I wasn't ready for more. She mentioned she was seeing a therapist to understand why she'd made such destructive choices. I told her that sounded like a good idea, but didn't elaborate. About a month after Mike's sentencing, I got an unexpected call from Gerald, the investor whose documents I'd copied. He'd received his first restitution payment from the court, only about 10% of what he'd lost, but better than nothing. He thanked me for encouraging him to record his conversation with Victor, which had become important evidence in the case. He also mentioned he'd been approached by a journalist writing a book about Mike's scam and suggested I might want to talk to her too. I was hesitant at first, but eventually agreed to meet with the journalist, a woman named Rachel who specialized in white-collar crime stories. She was fascinated by how I'd gathered evidence as a college student and wanted to feature my perspective prominently in her book. After checking with the prosecutors to make sure it wouldn't interfere with any ongoing investigations, I agreed to share my story. Rachel interviewed me several times over the next few weeks, Talking through everything chronologically helped me process it in a new way. I realized how much the investigation had shaped me, not just my career interests, but my ability to plan, be patient, and see connections between seemingly unrelated details. Summer was ending, and I was preparing to return to campus for junior year. Sarah and I had found a small apartment to share with another couple we were friends with. I was looking forward to a more normal college experience now that the Mike situation was resolved. Then Dad called with news that changed everything again. The FBI had contacted him because they'd found something strange while going through Mike's financial records. Apparently, Mike had been making regular payments to someone for years, long before he even met Mom. The payments were labeled as consulting fees, but went to a shell company that eventually traced back to Mom's brother, Uncle Steve. I was stunned. Uncle Steve had always been kind of a mysterious figure in our family. He lived across the country and only visited occasionally. Mom had always spoken highly of him, saying he was some kind of business consultant who worked with high-profile clients. The FBI wanted to interview Dad to see if he knew anything about Steve's connection to Mike. Dad was as confused as I was. He'd always gotten along fine with Steve during family gatherings, but didn't know much about his professional life. I immediately called Mom and demanded to know what was going on with Uncle Steve. She sounded genuinely shocked and claimed she had no idea about any connection between her brother and Mike. I wasn't sure whether to believe her, given all her previous lies. I took a few days off from internship prep to do some digging of my own. I searched public records for Uncle Steve and found he'd been involved in several businesses that had dissolved under suspicious circumstances. Nothing that had resulted in criminal charges, but definitely sketchy. I also found an old newspaper article mentioning him as a person of interest in an investment fraud case in Arizona about 8 years ago, though he was never charged. The pieces started falling into place. What if Uncle Steve had been Mike's connection to Mom in the first place? What if meeting at the casino wasn't random chance but a deliberate setup? I remembered Victor's testimony about Mike targeting Mom because of Dad's assets. Maybe Uncle Steve had suggested his sister as an easy mark. I called the FBI agent who had contacted Dad and shared my suspicions. She was interested but cautious, saying they needed more than circumstantial connections. I offered to send over everything I'd found on Uncle Steve, which she accepted. 2 days later, the FBI raided Uncle Steve's house in Oregon. They found evidence suggesting he'd been working with Mike for years, helping identify potential victims for his investment scams in exchange for a finder's fee. Mom had indeed been one of those victims, though the evidence suggested Steve hadn't expected Mike to actually marry her. That part had apparently been Mike's own improvisation. When confronted with the evidence, Uncle Steve quickly took a plea deal. He confirmed everything. He'd told Mike about his sister's unhappy marriage and her husband's solid financial position. He'd suggested Mike bump into her at the casino during her girls' weekend. He'd even coached Mike on Mom's interests and preferences to help him seem like her perfect match. Mom was devastated by this betrayal. Her own brother had essentially sold her to a con man. When the FBI showed her the evidence, she broke down completely. She called me sobbing so hard I could barely understand her. Despite everything she'd done, I felt a twinge of sympathy. Nobody deserves to be betrayed by their own family like that. I postponed my return to campus by a week to help Dad deal with the fallout. The FBI wanted statements from both of us about Uncle Steve's relationship with the family. The prosecutors were amending their case against Mike to include the new conspiracy charges involving Steve. During this time, I had several long conversations with Mom. Her world had completely collapsed. Her marriage to Dad destroyed by her own actions, her relationship with Mike revealed as a calculated con, and now the discovery that her beloved brother had set the whole thing in motion. She was hitting rock bottom, and despite my lingering anger, I couldn't just watch her drown. I suggested she join a support group for fraud victims. She initially resisted, saying she was too ashamed, but eventually agreed to try one meeting. To her surprise, she found people there with similar stories, smart, capable people who'd been taken in by skilled manipulators. It seemed to help her realize she wasn't uniquely stupid or gullible. As the summer ended, and I finally headed back to campus, things were still messy, but moving toward some kind of resolution. Uncle Steve was awaiting sentencing after pleading guilty to conspiracy charges. Mike was appealing his sentence, but had little chance of success given the mountain of evidence. Mom was working full-time at the real estate office and attending therapy twice a week. Dad and Carol set their wedding date for Christmas break, and Dad asked if I'd be his best man. I immediately said yes. Carol had been amazing through all of this chaos, supporting Dad without ever bad-mouthing Mom or making the situation about her. They deserved their happiness. Junior year started with a welcome sense of normalcy. Sarah and I settled into our apartment, and I threw myself into my classes with new focus. My experience had given me a unique perspective that my professors appreciated, especially in my forensic accounting courses. Mid-semester, I got an email from Rachel the journalist. Her book about Mike's scam was moving forward, and she'd secured a publisher. She wanted to meet again to go over some details and get my approval for the chapters featuring my investigation. We arranged to meet during my fall break. The book draft she showed me was impressive, a detailed account of how Mike and his associates had built their fraud empire, complete with diagrams of the money flow and profiles of key victims. My sections portrayed me as some kind of amateur detective hero, which was a bit embarrassing but also kind of cool. Rachel had titled the book, The College Kid and the Con Man, How a Teenager Brought Down a Multi-Million-Dollar Fraud. Publishers apparently love alliteration. I made a few factual corrections but otherwise approved my sections. Rachel mentioned the book would likely come out next summer and asked if I'd be willing to do some media interviews when it was published. I agreed cautiously, as long as it didn't interfere with my studies or internship. Around Thanksgiving, I got a surprising call from one of the FBI agents who'd worked on Mike's case. She asked if I'd be interested in applying for their honors internship program for the following summer. Apparently, my investigation had impressed some people in the white-collar crimes division. I was flattered and immediately said I'd apply. I went home for Thanksgiving, the first major holiday since everything had exploded. Dad and Carol hosted, creating new traditions to replace the old ones. Mom wasn't invited, which was awkward but necessary given everything that had happened. I did agree to have lunch with her the day after Thanksgiving. During that lunch, Mom seemed more grounded than I'd seen her in years. She'd been working steadily at the real estate office and had even gotten a small promotion. Her therapy was helping her understand her patterns of behavior and why she'd been vulnerable to someone like Mike. She asked thoughtful questions about my classes and Sarah, actually listening to my answers instead of waiting for her turn to talk. At the end of our meal, she handed me an envelope. Inside was a check for $5,000, not a huge amount, but significant given her current financial situation. She explained it was the first installment of paying me back for my portion of college expenses that Dad had been covering alone after the divorce. She'd been putting aside money from each paycheck, determined to take responsibility for her obligations. I was genuinely touched by the gesture. It wasn't about the money, but about her finally acknowledging the impact of her choices. I thanked her sincerely and told her I'd put it toward my student loans. For the first time in years, we parted with a real hug instead of an awkward side embrace. Christmas break brought Dad and Carol's wedding, a small, tasteful ceremony at their church, followed by a reception at their favorite restaurant. I gave a best man speech that made Dad tear up, talking about how he'd shown me what integrity looked like even in the hardest circumstances. Carol's teenage daughter from her first marriage gave a similarly emotional speech about how Dad had treated her with respect from day one. As I watched Dad and Carol have their first dance, I felt a sense of closure. Dad had found his way to happiness despite everything. He hadn't let bitterness consume him or define his future. I decided then that I wanted to follow his example. The new year brought more developments. Uncle Steve was sentenced to 7 years for his role in Mike's schemes. Mom joined a community college program to get her real estate broker's license, aiming to advance her career. I was accepted into the FBI summer internship program and would be working in their financial crimes division after the spring semester ended. Rachel's book was scheduled for publication in June, with a publicity tour to follow. The prosecutors had used some of my evidence-gathering techniques as examples in training materials for new financial crimes investigators, and Sarah and I were talking seriously about getting engaged after graduation the following year. Looking back on everything that had happened since that day when I was 14 and found Mom packing our suitcases, I realized how much it had shaped my life's direction. My obsession with exposing Mike had led me to discover my talent for financial investigation. My anger had eventually transformed into determination and then purpose. I still had complicated feelings about Mom, and probably always would, but I was no longer consumed by the need to punish her or make her regret her choices. She was punishing herself more effectively than I ever could have, and watching her struggle to rebuild her life from scratch wasn't satisfying. It was just sad. As for Mike, he would spend the next decade and a half in federal prison, his reputation destroyed, his ill-gotten gains confiscated. The man who had once swaggered around in designer suits showing off his sports cars was now wearing prison khakis and sharing a cell with other white-collar criminals. His downfall was complete. Dad had been right all along. The best revenge wasn't hurting people who hurt you, but living well despite them. I was building a life I was proud of, surrounded by people I trusted, doing work that mattered. That was a far better outcome than I could have imagined when I started my revenge journal at 15. When I returned to campus after winter break, I finally deleted all my remaining Mike files from my computer. I didn't need them anymore. The story had ended, and a new one was beginning.